The first site we're looking at is in Syria, and it is in fact a synagogue. But these synagogues are going to be the basis of Christianity. Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism in its earliest stages. So they're going to borrow tradition. This is no different than the Greeks borrowing traditions from the Egyptians, which we have seen, the Romans borrowing traditions from pretty much everyone that's around them. Exactly the same principle. Various hands will rule the people. Monotheism, of course, grows. This includes Judaism and Christianity. And art is going to be produced because typically this art is a teaching tool. It makes things concrete. It's very difficult to talk about abstract spiritual ideas without something to point to. So what we see is the art of late antiquity becoming the foundation of medieval art. And one of the earliest sites that we find is the synagogue at Dura Europos. The town was excavated after being taken from the empire by the Sassanians, and they will leave much of the town. The town was evacuated after being taken from the Roman Empire by the Sassanians, and this left much of the town intact. The desert basically moves in, and in 1920, they discover the site. So much like Pompeii, the fact that it's buried is what preserves it. In fact, that it's in the desert really helps the painting survive. And this is a synagogue, so this is where we would see the Jewish peoples of the area coming together to worship, typically on their Sabbath, which is, of course, Saturday. And what we see is a couple of things. First of all, this is a small pulpit just to the left-hand side of this niche, right as we're looking at it. The niche would contain the Torah. So it's no different than today a sanctuary in a church might contain the Holy Eucharist or something of great importance to that faith. If we look at the murals around it, they were originally what's called a biblical cycle. These are all Old Testament because, of course, we're looking at a Jewish synagogue, so we're not going to see the life of Jesus, for example. What we do see is a series of murals, and these are there to tell a story. Just like today in a church, you might look at the windows or some other form to help illustrate a sermon or a teaching that the priest or pastor is trying to give you. It was originally a private home and converted sometime in the late 2nd century. The pulpit is there for the sermon because you can imagine that they're going to be talking about these different stories, and each one is very similar to, for example, Aesop's Fables or something like that, where they're giving you a story. They're giving you an idea of how you should live your life. Now, is this a violation of the second commandment? Possibly. It depends on your interpretation, as we'll see over the next few chapters. Yet, these images from the Bible do exist, so there must have been some form of acceptance of them, some form of acceptance of the idea of creating these scenes. And these are narrative scenes. They're not just looking at people, but typically they're giving us stories. Now, the narrative scenes, when we look at them, here's Samuel anointing David, for example, tend to lack volume and depth. They tend to be very frontal. They tend to be very rigid. They tend to lack variation. Here, all of the faces, or nearly all of the faces, are identical. But when you think about it, what they're doing is something different. They're not trying to create the most beautiful form of art. They're trying to tell a story. They have a very specific thing that they're trying to get done. And here's the Pharaoh's daughter finding Moses, and we see the same thing. All of the women's faces, very, very similar. All of the forms, very, very basic. And we get this sort of expressionless face. It's as if the Greeks never existed. And that makes sense because we have a very limited pool of artists that are going to be working in this area. We're going to have a situation where getting the paintings done is more important, again, than creating something particularly stunning, particularly lifelike. I don't need that if I'm just telling a story. Think of children's books. We tend to simplify the form for just the same reason. We don't want you tied into, oh my gosh, look at the incredible realism. We want you focused on the story. We see very limited movements or gestures, although there are a few. So, for example, the woman in the foreground is definitely holding the child. The child looks very lifelike, very naturalistic in terms of proportion. The women surrounding her are relatively proportional, although they are identical. And it gets that story across. And that's really the important aspect of what we're seeing here in this very early form of art that will create or will inspire a lot of the early Christian art we're going to see, well, right now.